Hey, I'm Damon Garcia, bringing you some perspectives from the Christian left, and today we're going through Christian history, and we're going to talk about how did Christianity start as these communities where they shared everything in common, living in complete equality, turn into communities with a sharp division between clergy, the church leaders, and the people, with several time periods having the clergy being really rich and the people really poor. Rosa Luxemburg helps us understand, so let's get into it. So we've been going through this document, Socialism in the Churches, written in 1905 by Rosa Luxemburg, and this is part 4, so if you haven't watched the others, make sure you go watch those. Link is in the description. Part 4. We've been going through a bit of church history, and this is where we start to talk about what happened after the early church, which was this community where they shared everything in common. And how did we get to a place where obviously that's not what church is? So Rosa Luxemburg pretty much does a materialist reading of Christian history. So it's extremely interesting. This part of the whole thing really blew my mind. This is my favorite part, so let's get into it. She says, "In the beginning, when the number of Christians was small, the clergy did not exist in the proper sense of the word. The faithful, who formed an independent religious community, united together in each city. They elected a member..." By the way, they united together in each city. This is why each and every letter by Paul in the New Testament is called things like Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, because Romans is written to the singular church in Rome. Galatians written to the church in the city of Galatia. Thessalonians written to the church in the city of Thessalonica. So it's interesting, totally different time where each city had one singular church. It was the church of that city. She goes on and says, "They elected a member responsible for conducting the service of God and carrying out the religious rites. Every Christian could become a bishop or prelate. These functions were elective, subject to recall, honorary, and carried no power other than that which the community gave of its own free will. In proportion as the number of the faithful increased and the communities became more numerous and richer, to run the business of the community and to hold office became an occupation which demanded a great deal of time and full concentration." So I'm sure so far this is making a whole lot of sense. You got little communities and you just elect, okay, today you're gonna run the service. And then as you get bigger and bigger and bigger, you end up needing to have a person to dedicate all their time to their job in order to keep the community running. As the office bearers cannot carry out these tasks at the same time as following their private employment, the custom grew up of electing from among the members of the community an ecclesiastic who was exclusively entrusted with these functions. Therefore, these employees of the community had to be paid for their exclusive devotion to its affairs. Thus, there formed within the church a new order of employees of the church, which separated itself from the main body of the faithful, the clergy. Parallel with the inequality between the rich and the poor, there arose another equality, that between the clergy and the people. The ecclesiastics, at first elected among equals with a view to performing a temporary function, raised themselves to form a caste which ruled over the people. Each city has its own set of clergy, which are now a separate group. The group of clergy all over and the group of the church people all over. The more numerous the Christian communities became in the cities of the enormous Roman Empire, the more the Christians persecuted by the government felt the need to unite to gain strength. The communities scattered all over the territory of the empire therefore organized themselves into one single church, which, by the way, they often talked about this one single church and called it the one apostolic, meaning the church that formed from the influence of the apostles, the one apostolic Catholic church. Catholic was initially lowercase c, which meant global, universal, general, the global, universal, entire church. That's what Catholic used to mean. This unification was already a unification of the clergy and not of the people. From the 4th century, the ecclesiastics of the communities met together in councils. The first council took place at Nicaea in 325. They would later come up with the Nicene Creed, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard, which includes in it, I believe in the one holy Catholic Church. Also at these councils, they decided what would be included in the New Testament, and they decided what are all these churches going to believe together. That's the reason creeds were even made. Because creed, coming from the word creo, which means believe, that's why they all start with I believe, because they needed a way to unify all these churches in all these cities. So they would gather together in these councils saying, this is what we're deciding together to believe. In this way, there was formed the clergy, an order apart and separated from the people. So far, this separation is purely for practical reasons, not so malicious. But here's where it gets a little bit sketchy. The bishops of the stronger and richer communities took the lead at the councils. That is why the Bishop of Rome soon placed himself at the head of the whole of Christianity and became the Pope. Yeah, for those that don't know, the Pope was just the guy who was the pastor at the church in Rome. And since that church was the most rich and successful and the biggest, he became the leader of all the other priests and pastors and clergy. Thus, the Pope. Thus, an abyss separated the clergy, divided up in the hierarchy from the people. So not only was there created a separation between the clergy and the people, but now there's separation even within the clergy itself, a hierarchy with the ones who were the leaders of the richest churches becoming the leaders. She goes on, at the same time, the economic relations between the people and the clergy underwent a great change. Before the formation of this order, all that the rich members of the church offered to the common property belonged to the poor people. Afterwards, a great part of the funds was spent on paying the clergy and running the church. Very important to recognize that before we continue. That the money that would come in would first go to poor people, and the rest would go to pay the clergy and for running the church. When in the 4th century, that's where we're at now, Christianity was protected by the government and was recognized at Rome as being the dominant religion, because Constantine, the Roman emperor of the time, became a Christian. The persecutions of the Christians ended, and the services were no longer carried on in catacombs or in the modest halls, but in churches, which began to be more and more magnificently built. These expenses thus reduced the funds intended for the poor. Did you catch that? Because it was now legal and perfectly fine to be a Christian and to meet with other Christians, these meetings became bigger and bigger. Instead of just finding a secret spot in the dark to have these meetings, like wherever we can find a place to gather, they became particular buildings where we meet together. And several people started going because they just wanted to look good for the emperor. And so as these communities grew, the buildings which they met in grew, which meant a lot of the money that was initially meant to go to the poor people first went to building these buildings. By the way, I just want to mention real quick too, during this time, people like Saint Benedict of Nursia and others went to the desert and made their own communities where they dedicated every day to just prayer and work. And they felt like, okay, clearly this is just how I would word it. They felt clearly that the whole thing has become commercialized. And we need to go back to our roots and figure out how to do this whole thing differently. And this was the beginning of the monastic communities, of the monks. So when you think of like the orders of monks and nuns that are separated from society and dedicate their life to prayer and work, this was the beginning of that, because they saw how commercialized Christianity had become. They're like, let's separate ourselves and get to the root of this. All right, let's continue. She says, already in the 5th century, the revenues of the church were divided into 4 parts. The first for the bishop, which is the main pastor. The second for the minor clergy. The third for the upkeep of the church. And it was only the 4th part which was distributed among the needy. The poor Christian population received therefore a sum equal to what the bishop received for himself alone. So remember we said it started out with like all the money goes to the poor and what's left goes to the clergy? Now the complete reversal. And this sequence of events isn't happening for malicious reasons necessarily. all for very practical reasons. Things are moving fast, we're growing, we're having to figure out how can we continue these communities. And in this, the priority of helping the poor starts to fall lower and lower and lower as they're trying to figure out how can we survive with these communities growing bigger and bigger. She continues, in course of time, the habit was lost of giving to the poor a sum determined in advance. Moreover, as the higher clergy gained in importance, the faithful no longer had control over the property of the church. The bishops gave to the poor according to their good pleasure. Charity. The people received alms for their own clergy. But that is not all. At the beginning of Christianity, the faithful made goodwill offerings to the common stock. As soon as the Christian religion became a state religion, the clergy demanded that gifts must be brought by the poor as well as by the rich. Interesting. As it's becoming a state religion, as it's becoming basically a business, it no longer is just saying, okay, the rich, those who have, must bring for those who have not. It is now those who have must bring, and those who don't have must also bring. Very strange, but this is one of the things that is happening as it's growing. From the 6th century, the clergy imposed a special tax, the tithe, 10th part of the crops, which had to be paid to the church. This tax crushed the people like a heavy burden. In the course of the Middle Ages, it became a real scourge to the peasants oppressed by serfdom. The tithe was levied on every piece of land, on every property, but it was always the serf who paid it by his labor. Thus, the poor people not only lost the help and support of the church, but they saw the priests ally themselves with their other exploiters, princes, nobles, and moneylenders. In the Middle Ages, while the working people sank into poverty through serfdom, the church grew richer and richer. Besides the tithe and other taxes, the church benefited at this period from great donations, legacies made by rich debauchees of both sexes who wished to make up at the last moment for their life of sin, to spend their whole life partying and living in debauchery, and then at the last moment they're like, okay, maybe if I donate a bunch of my money before I die, it'll make up for it. They gave and made over to the church money, houses, entire villages with their serfs, and often ground rents or customary labor dues, corvées. In this way, the church acquired enormous wealth. At the same time, the clergy ceased to be the administrator of the wealth, which the church had entrusted it. It openly declared in the 12th century, by formulating a law which it said came from the Holy Scripture, that the wealth of the church belongs not to the faithful, but is the individual property of the clergy and of its chief, the Pope, above all. The money doesn't belong to the people. Like we start with this community where everything we have belongs to everybody. Now it's like, no. The riches and wealth and everything we have belongs to not just the clergy, but the highest of the clergy, the Pope. Man, such a huge difference. But it's like step by step, we see this happening. Ecclesiastical positions therefore offered the best opportunities to obtain large revenue. So wild. Like how this starts off as just like a very practical position among religious communities of like, okay, we need somebody to run the service today, pick you, to now it's like a position that like everyone knows, oh yeah, that's like the highest paying job in town, to be that. Each ecclesiastic disposed of the property of the church as if it were his own, and largely endowed from it his relatives, sons, and grandsons. By this means, the goods of the church were pillaged and disappeared into the hands of the families of the clergy. So it's like all this money that initially was just for the people to meet their needs, particularly for poor people, now is all just going to the families of the clergy. For that reason, the popes declared themselves to be the sovereign proprietors of the fortunes of the church and ordained the celibacy of the clergy in order to keep it intact and to prevent their patrimony from being dispersed. That was like one of the most mind-blowing things I read. Now, of course, we could also choose to say, come on, that's not why the church got their priests to be celibate. It was so that they could fully dedicate their lives to the thing. Which, yeah, okay. even if you believe that wasn't the reason that they required their priests to become celibate, this was definitely one of the consequences. The church can now keep more money if all the employees of the church have no families to give it to. Celibacy was decreed in the 11th century, but it was not put into practice until the 13th century in view of the opposition of the clergy. Further, to prevent the dispersal of the church's wealth, in 1297, Pope Boniface VIII forbade ecclesiastics to make a present of their incomes to laymen without permission of the Pope. Now he's saying all the priests out there cannot give any gifts to their people. You gotta ask the Pope first. Which I imagine just created a scenario where people, it's not like it was that easy to contact the Pope in the 12th century. And so I just imagine that creating scenarios where it's like, I really want to give this gift to my people, but I gotta find a way to ask the Pope. That's just too much trouble. So I guess I won't give a gift today. Thus, the church accumulated enormous wealth, especially in arable lands, and the clergy of all Christian countries became the most important landed proprietor. It often possessed a third or more than a third of all the lands of the country. Now, by the way, some of this stuff you probably learned in school growing up, but also, let's just recognize here, this is very different from today's American churches, where people are constantly talking about how much power the American church is losing these days and how we're increasingly a secularized society. But know that there was so much of church history where the church was in control. Let's continue. The peasant people paid not only the labor dues, corvée, but the tithes as well, and that not only on the lands of the princes and the nobles, but on enormous tracts where they worked directly for the bishops, archbishops, parsons, and convents. Among all the mighty lords of feudal times, the church appeared as the greatest exploiter of all. Man, how do we get here? It's like, okay, we're reading about how we get here, but it's still just so shocking how the community we read about in Acts can become this. She goes on, in France, for example, at the end of the 18th century, before the Great Revolution, the clergy possessed the fifth part of all the territory of the country, with an annual income of about 100 million francs. The tithes paid by the proprietors amounted to 23 million. This sum went to fatten 2,800 prelates and bishops, 5,600 superiors and priors, 60,000 parsons and curates, and 24,000 monks and 26,000 nuns who filled the cloisters. This army of priests was freed from taxation. On top of all that, on top of receiving all this money from taxes and tithes, they also don't have to pay taxes, and from the requirement to perform military service. In times of calamity, war, bad harvest, epidemics, the church paid to the state treasury a voluntary tax which never exceeded 16 million francs. The clergy, thus privileged, formed with the nobility a class living on the blood and sweat of the serfs. The high posts in the church and those which paid best were distributed only to the nobles and remained within the hands of the nobility. Consequently, in the period of serfdom, the clergy was the faithful ally of the nobility, giving it support and helping it to oppress the people, to whom it offered nothing but sermons, according to which they should remain humble and resign themselves to their lot. So sad. This is heavy stuff. This is what I'm talking about. Before being a community that gave all of themselves to the people, and now all they're given is sermons saying, deal with it. Just remain humble. Don't try to fight for more than you have. Don't try to have the radical faith that Jesus told us to have. When the country and town proletariat rose up against oppression and serfdom, it found in the clergy a ferocious opponent instead of an ally, which they would be if they actually tried to be like Jesus. It is also true, even within the church itself, there existed two classes: the higher clergy, who engulfed all the wealth and the great mass of the country parsons, whose modest livings brought in no more than 500 francs to 2,000 francs a year. Therefore, this unprivileged class revolted against the superior clergy, and in 1789, during the Great Revolution, it joined up with the people to fight against the power of the lay and ecclesiastical nobility. Okay, so that's the end of part 4. Which is just wild to think about, that the Christian community would become a system that people would have to fight against. So powerful and so oppressive that it is causing massive injustice. So strange to think that that's what the church would become when you read about what it was in the book of Acts. So there's a history of the origin of how we got clergy and how the church became an oppressive system. Actually, it gets way worse. In part 5, we'll continue this history and talk about how it became further and further from its original mission and what the original community was, and how it became even more parallel with capitalism. But that's that part for now, and here's all I want to say. Church history can be pretty dark, pretty grim, and pretty sad and tragic. But I do know, whenever I read the terrible violence of Christian history, I know that during each of these time periods, there have always been people who saw what the larger church was doing and said, nope, that doesn't look like Jesus, and just did their own thing against the grain. People like Saint Benedict of Nursia, who I had mentioned earlier. People like Saint Francis of Assisi, who lived in Italy with the Pope, who the Pope was leading the Crusades to massacre all of these Muslims, thinking, how do we spread Christianity? Oh, I know, we take over lands and kill anyone who gets in our way. So crazy. And Francis was like, no. And by the way, Pope Francis named himself after Saint Francis, and Saint Francis was like, no, there's another way. And he committed his life completely to poverty and humility and serving the poor every way he can, and started a whole group where they dedicated themselves to the same thing, group that exists today, to calling themselves Franciscans. So it's interesting. I call myself a Christian. And when I think about the kind of Christian I want to be, I think about this other stream of humble and loving Christians who wanted to just be like Jesus, who wanted to spread this thing through love and service, not through conquering and oppression. So I wanted to say that if this made you feel pretty depressed and hopeless, there is hope. You don't have to be this kind of Christian, even though our tradition and history is filled with these kind of Christians. You could be someone who says, nope, not gonna live that way. I'm gonna try my best to live like Jesus, even if the large chunk of Christianity is doing ridiculous stuff. So, thank you for watching. We'll continue on this journey throughout Christian history from the perspective of lovely Rosa Luxemburg. And yeah, hope to see you in part 5. See you later.